Hi everyone, it's Ren here. Happy Sunday, guys, and welcome. Today we're going to be talking something that is not, as promised, something light and entertaining. Hopefully it will be entertaining. I don't know about light, but we're going to go back to exploring the relationship between personality types and neuroscience. Perhaps we could also say between types and science, between a theory of type and its relationship to science. So, I'm thinking particularly of those approaches. You might be familiar with Dario Nardi's approach, which seeks to establish this correlation and to verify it empirically. There's a video that I saw of his where he talks about just conducting experiments on people who identify as the INFJ and looking at how their brains might have structural similarities or function similarly. So what do we think of that? And if we see limitations to that approach, does that mean that we just ought to stop looking for such a correlation? Or could we look at other approaches that are more promising? And I'm thinking particularly of cognitive typology that employs the typing by visual cues, also known as voltology. It's a topic I'm really interested in. I'm in very regular discussion with that community, and I'm kind of curious to know what you guys think, because I've made videos on this before, but the reactions, it's been lots of views, but the comments haven't always been very verbose or expansive, and I'd be curious to have more. And I promise you that if you guys are productive and answer my hopes, I'll get a shave, or at least a trim, because I'm starting to look like a lumberjack, and the sweater doesn't help. Now, before I move on to my topic, just remember quickly that I have written 2 books in the last year and a half. My book on the INFJ, the Ecstatic Soul, you can find on Amazon, links below for less than $10. And my new novel, The Infinite Castle. Existentialism, Camus, Dostoevsky, and so on. If you're really into this stuff, Kafka too. Check it out, links below. Patreon supporters, thank you so much. You are helping me to continue this channel, and I am eternally grateful for that. Now, I'll tell you what I think is one of the problems with this idea of correlating or anchoring personality type in neuroscience. The problem is not intrinsic to the theory of types. It has much more to do with how type is measured, type is determined. Largely, at least the vast majority of people who engage in the theory of types, personality types, engage in it through a first-person, I was going to say through a first-person ontology, but maybe this would be getting too complex too quickly. Essentially, they engage it through a first-person perspective, subjective perspective. Another way to put it is that most of you in my community, I am sure, you've discovered your type. Maybe some of you are still hesitating, but most of you have discovered your type. I suspect that in the majority of cases, that type is INFJ, given the nature of this channel. But you've discovered it through personal exploration, all right? So one might agree that the typing through tests, typing through the dichotomies is not the most reliable approach, and it is better to look at the literature on the cognitive functions, look at the Jungian literature, the psychological types, and other things, qualitative explorations of how you holistically relate to a particular function stack, all right? So that will lead you to what I think, and what you yourself obviously think, would be a more accurate description. There's a cat that's complaining they want to be let in, but I'm recording a video. What am I supposed to do? So you think it's more accurate. There's different levels of assessing it accurately, but the essential point to appreciate and to acknowledge here is that in all of these cases, the first person ontology remains implicit, presupposed. In other words, even if we arrive at a method of arriving at our type that is extremely fine-grained, detailed, and qualitative, and isn't just the sloganeering of the dichotomies that leads 3/4 of the channel led by INFJs to be by non-INFJs, right? But who am I to speak? According to some models, I'm not an INFJ. But, I think this community has faith in me being an INFJ, and that matters. But it's always subjective. I prefer saying first person because subjective has a kind of negative connotation sometimes, as if it was like less valuable than the objective. It's just a different ontology. It's a different conceptual scheme, right? It is equally as valid, depends on your perspective. But it's a subjective approach. We determine it. We don't use like a model that just, we plug in the evidence and the model kicks out the, outputs the results. That's your type. But if so, then what the neuroscientific evidence, if that evidence, let's consider that it is reliable, okay, for the sake of this argument, in the Nardi experiments, let's say, about the NFPs. Well, the correlates that we find in the brain are going to be correlates that have to do more with the reasons that these people identify as INFPs, because these are objective, right? It is objective that these people subjectively identify as ENFPs. So you can find the correlates in the brain for that. But you will not find the correlates between the brain systems and the ENFP type. You will find it between the brain system and a disposition to identify as ENFP. That's subjective. But being ENFP, that's subjective if it's arrived at subjectively. Again, it's not inferior to an objective viewpoint. It's a different, in a way, it's a different world. Call it a different ontology, but it's a different world. Just the private and the public, is another way that you put it. Privately, ENFP. Publicly, we don't know. There's been no identification. Publicly, someone who identifies as ENFP, but only privately ENFP. For me, privately INFJ. Publicly, I don't know. Until we have a method, a system to give an objective, to output an objective assessment of my type, we don't know. Now, as it happens, there is such a system, all right? And this system is called cognitive typology. That is a system that allows you to bypass the identify as INFJ or identify as ENFP bit. It allows you to go straight to what type you are, all right? Now, that's a controversial system. There's critics of ontology, there's critics of cognitive typology, the idea of typing by visual cues. I used to be skeptical, and I still am, because a healthy degree of skepticism is essential to a productive conversation within a research community, but there's a couple interesting things to say here. The first thing to say is to hopefully really be able to articulate that the only way to have any kind of meaningful correlate between brain states, right, or the neurology, or the neurological observation of a person's brain, and their type is through having identified type through objective means. You can't have an objective-subjective correlate. That's not possible, because you're assuming that you can bridge a gap that has never been bridged in the history of philosophy ever since Descartes attempted to, or Leibniz. They never managed. So, even nowadays Chomsky acknowledges it, and so you can't do that. What you can do is have this correlate, or at least the possibility of this correlate as a meaningful enterprise, if you determine this possibility, and typing by objective visual cues So Voltology will determine whether you're systematically moving your hands a certain way or not moving them. But if your hand movements tend to be harmonious and parabolic and soft and coordinated with your articulation of words, tends to indicate an FE, function at work. If it's more kind of vertical and not completely harmonized with the way you speak, tends to be a bit more forceful, a bit more rigid in some sense, tends to identify a TE Voltology, a TE function at work. If you disengage a lot, that is to say, when I speak to you, if I often go like this and then I come back, or like that and then I come back, that tends to identify a JI function that's probably conscious. So FI or TI, then you identify the difference between whether you're strong on FI or TI by looking at whether, very broadly speaking, because this system's more complex than this, but whether when I disengage, is there emotional neutralization or is there not emotional neutralization? So if I disengage like this, whereas if I disengage like this, so that's, well, I mean, again, you'd have to kind of go more into the system to understand the differences. But then NI also has a distinction with SI. So both have in common that you do diagonal drifts. So when I speak and you stay locked in like this, or you have a fixed gaze, and what they call a viscous inertia, how you hold yourself when you're sitting down, and whether you are more fluid. I'm sitting on something, a chair that's moving, so it's not a good chair to be sitting in, because it can bias results. But generally speaking, imagine that I have a chair that's not moving. If my posture tends to be more rigid, then I'm more, it tends to indicate that my lead function is a judging function. That includes TI lead, because TI is a judging function. If I am more fluid, tends to indicate that I'm probably a perceiving lead, which means you can be anywhere from SE or NE or NI or SI. Now, that's to give you a little bit of a taste. And the idea is that it's systematic for people, and that systematically people of a certain type will have these cues. What matters is identifying which cues they are and what's their hierarchy in terms of the dominance. Why are people skeptical? That's really the question that I want to ask. Is the skeptical due to the fact that, well, it's a theory, by definition we ought to be skeptical. Let's look at what its merits are, its demerits, what it can work on, what is areas that are... If the skepticism is a priori, then I think it's suspicious, and we ought to ask ourselves, can we rid ourselves of it, Some people will say, well, it looks like phrenology, associating particular traits or sometimes racial traits to people's anatomy. But this system is very clear on the fact that anatomy biases visual cues. In other words, you have to be able, and one of the challenges of assessing someone's type is to bypass the anatomy in order to be able to look at the visual cues. Because sometimes having a particular eye anatomy might make you look more like an SI dominant or an SI user than an NI user. In fact, that's my case. I'm not going to go into why. But anatomy obstructs correct observation. So we're not talking about phrenology here. Okay. Now, it's important to realize if that method actually yields reliable results, then you have an objective type identification, which you can try to correlate with neuroscience, okay? Neurological observation. That's the only way. Why aren't people interested in this, or why are people rejecting it? I think the legitimate response, in my opinion, is, well, I think that the whole point of personality exploration is that it has a first-person ontology. That we are not taken out of the equation. Because if we are taken out of the equation, if I am taken out of the equation as merely an assessment of my type and neurology, well, then what's the point? Isn't that emptying personality exploration of its substance? But why not have them side by side? Would it not be interesting to have the first-person ontology of personality and the third-person one? Is that something that is contradictory in the first place, too paradoxical, it doesn't make sense. I'd love to hear your thoughts and your non-dogmatic thoughts, because I know that you guys are not dogmatic. And I think, unfortunately, that both on the first-person ontology side of things and on the third-person ontology side of things, there's too much dogmatism. You know, there's people who are all for subjective exploration and at the exclusion of the third-person exploration. And then, of course, we have all the scientists or scientific scientists of this world who would be all for the third-person exploration at the expense of the first person. Why can't they exist side by side? That's what I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. And have you ever considered getting typed by cognitive typology, by visual cues, so that you'd have an assessment of your objective type? And if not, what is stopping you? Just very curious. Let me know in the comments, guys. Don't forget my Patreon, and I will see you next week. See you then.